Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP, joined now by Ausin Berg. He's the executive director of the Chicago Policy Center and the author of The New Chicago Way. Ausin, good to have you back on the show.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it.
So what's our mayor up to these days? Just checking in. I know we get a little parochial here on the show. I know it's a national show, but I like to focus on Chicago every now and then because there's a lot happening, and obviously I am based here, and so I follow this stuff closer than most. But I also think, Ausin, you know, we're talking about what's going on with Mamdani in New York. We're talking about, you know, we spent a lot of time during the fires talking about Karen Bass in Los Angeles. So good to check in on what's going on in one of the major American cities and being run by Brandon Johnson, who's obviously a very progressive guy. And he's now proposing, he gave a press conference the other day, said basically everything's on the table with regard to the budget, including the idea of a head tax. Explain sort of what our situation is here and what the mayor is opening the door to.
Several things going on here. So Chicago exploded its spending over the COVID era. The budget went up by about 40%. And yet the city is still facing $1 billion deficit going into next year. Many people think, oh, well, the only way to close this is via a property tax hike. Brandon Johnson promised over and over again he was not going to hike property taxes during his campaign. His CFO came out last week and told Bloomberg, hey, yeah, property taxes are likely. And then Brandon Johnson came out and said, no, it's not going to be part of my proposal. So then he had this press conference and people were like, well, what is?
And just as a reminder, he tried proposing a property tax increase, right? And it was completely
it's mayhem and from a communications perspective, because yes, he proposed last year a $300 million property tax hike, and that spurred the only ever 50-0 city council vote against a sitting mayor. That has never happened in the history of Chicago. It happened on Brandon Johnson's property tax. So somehow
he revised it down to like 162 million, and that didn't fly. And then he revised it down to 0. It was like, okay, we finally got the idea. But anyway,
yes, it ratcheted down. He lost about 4 other smaller property tax hikes until it finally went to 0, and he gave up. So somehow his chief financial officer was not on the same page about this, and he floated this as a possibility, and he had to then come out and walk it back. So now people are asking, well, what are you going to do? Chicago's already on a negative credit rating. We have the worst credit rating of any big city in the country. Puerto Rico is really the only place in the U.S. that's worse from a municipal government standpoint in terms of its credit rating.
So hard to believe.
And here's the thing: he will not say that cuts are on the board. He will not discuss furloughs. He will not discuss cuts. So the only thing that is on the table, and that's what you're referring to, are just these various revenue schemes. And you can say a lot, at the federal level, you want to tweak tax policy to like tax the rich more. Okay, have that debate. When we're talking about cities that are highly competitive, the capital is highly mobile, these kinds of proposals don't work well. They will be lost leaders. And he mentioned one, the corporate head tax, which Chicago did have. It actually repealed it in 2014, I believe. But this is a per job tax. So if you're a corporation in Chicago, you get taxed based on how many people you hire, which is, anyone listening knows why that's a bad idea.
It is. Where did this? I'm going to have to go back and do some research on where the head tax came from, because it's such a, obviously, as you say, catastrophically bad idea that would just kill growth, kill jobs. And as you mentioned, one of the things about, especially post-COVID with, people being able to work remotely, we've seen a lot of movement of corporations flight out of blue cities, blue states into red cities, red states. It would think, including from here, by the way, that politicians would try something different, but it seems like that's not the case. So is this going to go anywhere? I mean, there were some other, I guess, tax schemes that were proposed, none of which seem any better, but what are the other options that are quote unquote on the table?
Yeah, there was some talk of basically what amounts to a payroll tax. Seattle did this, where it's essentially folks making over a certain amount, the corporation is taxed on a chunk of their payroll. It's almost like a city income tax. And there are many reasons why people think that would be unconstitutional in Illinois. We have a flat tax protection in our constitution in this state, which is one of the only kind of pro-taxpayer protections that we have. J.B. Pritzker spent more than $50 million on a campaign to try to repeal that in 2020, and voters rejected it. So I don't think that's going anywhere. I do think it's important, though, to note, uh, even if these tax hikes don't go anywhere, it's harmful to the city's image and its ability to attract capital when these things are even tossed out, and especially when they're tossed out without the a fully baked plan for how this is going to actually solve the city's problems. Instead, it's just this sort of one-way ratchet on the revenue side, and that it's very hard to attract businesses that way. And when asked about this, Brandon Johnson, there was a very pointed question to Johnson at this press conference saying, well, what about those people who call this tax a jobs killer? And he said, well, when businesses talk to me, when corporate leaders talk to me, they only talk about public safety. They don't talk about job killers. And that is just absurd. He has not had experience in the private sector. And the idea that private industry is not talking about the tax burden of big cities, about the debt burden, which then turns into taxes of big cities, that's absurd. So the final thing I'll note on that too, Tom, is Chicago is different than many other big blue union-dominated cities in that we don't have voter approval for tax hikes and for new debt. That is a very common accountability mechanism in cities across the country. And I would encourage folks on the Chicago City Council to make that any part of any deal that you're going to have to put your name on a tax hike for Brandon Johnson's tax hike. That better be a voter approval. That should be a democratic process. And that's a good accountability mechanism when you have that in place.
Brandon Johnson, you mentioned this question about all these business leaders that he's been supposedly talking to. And he's got this advisory board that's supposed to meet and come up with recommendations for how to fill this budget gap. But he sort of was front running them at this press conference, right? He sort of put all this stuff out, which is, as you mentioned, not something that, you would traditionally do if you were looking for people to give you sort of unvarnished advice behind closed doors. You'd probably try and want to wait and get their proposals. But be that as it may, I mean, if you were on his advisory board, if you had his ear, I mean, what are the solutions? What can be done? You mentioned that, spending now, and I think this is true at the federal level too. It's like 50% more than it was pre-COVID. I mean, we just absolutely flooded the system, and those dollars just, instead of, paying down debt or getting put into a rainy day fund, they just got spent. Now they're gone, and the problem still exists. So what would you recommend? How can Chicago work its way out of the fiscal hole that it's in?
The number one thing to do when you are digging a hole fiscally is to stop digging. And that requires Brandon Johnson to just simply say publicly that a current bill in Springfield, it's a pension sweetener bill for Chicago pensions. It's on Governor J.B. Pritzker's desk right now. This bill increases pension benefits for some police employees and some fire employees in the city of Chicago. We have the worst pension debt of any city in the country. We have 7 of the 10 worst funded pensions in the country are in Chicago, and this bill would make it worse. So you got to tell Pritzker.
Is JB going to sign that?
I don't think he will. I think I shouldn't say I don't think he will. I should say I've been encouraged by Pritzker's public comments saying, raising questions about it. And his main question about it has been, how is Chicago going to pay for this? And that's the right question. This bill, this pension sweetener, costs the city $60 million next year. It costs the city $750 million a year by 2055. It's a ramp. And this is the nature of these defined benefit pensions. They're fiscally insane. It makes the retirement security of our first responders, police and fire, it makes their retirements less secure. It takes them from 25% funded, which is a joke, worst in the country, to 18% funded. So you're talking about these things just going insolvent, really, at that point. And how is that pro-police or pro-fire to do that? So that's the first thing Brandon Johnson needs to do is say, hey, Springfield, stop digging. We cannot afford this right now. That's what I would suggest you do.
But that isn't going to, I mean, that might get us a little bit of the way there. We've got about a minute left. I mean, what else can be done? I mean, are there jobs that can be cut? Spending can be, I mean,
absolutely. So there needs
Doge city government.
Labor needs to be brought to the table, and labor needs to be told Chicagoans are tapped out on tax hikes. We need skin in the game from government worker unions. That could be in furlough days. It may require layoffs. But we're talking here about returning to 2019 spending levels. We're not talking about becoming like a third world, country backwater that has no public services. We are going back to the, medieval days of 2019, that city
Right.
services, which is, that is tough. I'm not saying that there aren't sacrifices that need to be made, but it's also that when you increase taxes and fees on the existing Chicago businesses, you start a death spiral. And you could even, as part of that, discuss some ways to enhance revenue, but it has to be a picture that's done together. And it also needs to come with those accountability mechanisms I talked about, like voter approval of tax hikes and new debt. You need an independent budget office and city council. You need some structural reforms to earn the trust of Chicagoans to go along with any kind of tax hike that's being discussed.
All right. We will leave it there. Ausin Berg, Executive Director, Chicago Policy Center, author of The New Chicago Way. Ausin, always great to have you. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Tom.